If you like categorizing things, I got an interesting one for you, truth seeking. I have this model where I've basically just divided the love of truth into 4 expressions, on the light of which I will then explain science, philosophy, religion, and personal experience. The first expression is lust for certainty. This is the passion to know, the desire to understand and make sense of the world. This desire is inevitably accompanied by the temptation to reduce what might otherwise be indefinitely complex into a glittering but maybe not so gold bundle of categories. In trying to understand, there's always the risk that your grasp is so violent, you're left with something that resembles more the shape of your hand than the original shape of what you were trying to understand in the first place. And so holistic reverence is simply the gentleness of your grasp, understanding insofar as the insights remain wholesome and do not betray the complexities of the world. Then we have fear of untruth. Like the fear of a mother, this fear is not an antagonist of love, but a consequence of it. It is care and concern for the knowledge to be actually true, and not just a hollow certainty. Finally, we have faith. In this context, a lot of people like to define faith as belief in the absence of evidence, but I'm gonna go with the courage to explore and wonder in the absence of a guarantee that you will not be deceived or deluded. So that's the model. Now, first on the chopping block is science. This is an obvious lust for certainty plus fear of untruth, mostly fear of untruth. Scientists want to understand and make sense of the world, but what science does for scientists is mostly honoring the fear of untruth, making sure the knowledge is actually true. This is why falsifiability is such an important feature here, to the point some would go as far as to define science as the study of the falsifiable. The result of this is that in science, you get to stand on the shoulders of giants and be pretty damn sure those shoulders will not buckle. Yeah, they might crack and pop every once in a while, but you can trust the general integrity of the giants, because the only way you get to be a giant in the first place is through a very rigorous examination of your bones. And in this way, you can stack massive towers of knowledge, giant over giant, generation after generation, and the results speak for themselves. Quite astonishing have been the achievements of science. Give it up for science, everybody. Science cool. However, sometimes in science we see cowardice, because convenient as it would be for all true things to also be falsifiable, why the hell would that be the case? Obviously that's not the case, and so what do we do about these truths? Do we just give up? Do we just abandon the pursuit of the truths that are not easy and convenient to falsify? Surely not, right? There has to be a way to preserve at least the spirit of science in the absence of the most clean and perfect conditions for its practice. In the words of Frederick Myers, men who insist on electric lamps along the road will never reach the center of Africa. Yet often you see this attitude where it's like, the center of Africa? Yeah, that's not science. I don't give a shit. Like, bro, where's your curiosity? Or worse, you'll get something like Africa. Africa doesn't exist, dumbass. Who told you about Africa? And you'll be like, no, Africa is certainly a place. And they'll be like, yeah, right, show me then. Bring Africa to me if you say Africa's real. But no, that's not how it works. I can't bring Africa to you. And they'll be like, of course that's not how it works. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that in the best interest of a liar that that's not how it works? But motherfucker, it's a continent. It's not my fault that I can't move it, but we can go. Let's go. And they'll be like, yeah, I'm not about to waste my time looking for some bullshit I already know doesn't exist, am I? And that is what a coward would say. Compare this to philosophy, where your philosopher is just gonna bolt it straight to the center of Africa in flip-flops and shorts, no shirt, no box spray, no water, no tent, no vehicle, no friends, and one candle. And yet they will arrive. Maybe not at the center of Africa necessarily, but they will arrive somewhere, and that's pretty cool. In philosophy, there's no drama about what we can or cannot investigate. Anything goes. And because anything goes, there's a lot of variety, but I think we can still stereotype all of philosophy as being always both graspy and rational. Rational because even if the substance of your philosophy is something like a critique of rationality, the medium by which that critique is going to be made is probably still rational. You're probably going to be defending and arguing rationally that rationality is not enough for whatever it is, right? So based on this stereotype, I'm placing philosophy in the lust for certainty plus faith quadrant. And the reason it's not fear of untruth, even though it's rational, is because it is only rational. It's not like in science where we keep rationality in check with data, which is a big deal because the thing about pure rationality is that sure, it works amazingly well and incredibly reliably when it works, but the moment that it stops working, it immediately becomes not just useless, but profoundly counterproductive. And philosophers are just gonna ride the edge of that cliff, which on its own is cool. That's adventure, rock and roll, but this in combination with lust for certainty sometimes creates debauchery. And I'll give you an example, the ontological argument for the existence of God. If you haven't heard this before, it goes like this. God is a maximally great being by definition. Such a being could either exist only in your imagination or also in real life. Existing also in real life is more great than existing only in your imagination. So if God existed only in your imagination, then he wouldn't be maximally great, would he? But he's maximally great by definition. Remember, there therefore God must also exist in real life, baby. Come on. No, man, what the hell is this? And I'm not gonna get into the weeds as to the logic here, because the issue is not that the argument is bad, which it is. The issue is the hubris to think, what's that? Is that an ancient question that humanity has struggled with for thousands of years? Yeah, I can probably get that over with a bit of logic. And then to think that this shit will do. And even if it did do, by the way, what would that accomplish? Say that you convinced an atheist with this argument, now what? Do they know God any better than they did yesterday? Probably not, right? And so much more interesting than the truth value of such a stupidly abstract notion is what of the presence of God we may get to experience in this world. And that brings us to religion. Religion is another obvious one, right? Reverence and faith, those are religious sounding words. It's probably those. And yeah, for one, most of religion does a pretty good honor of holistic reverence. And if there's one exception to that, it's probably arrogance of interpretation when it comes to scripture, right? Because when you have a sacred text, that text shoulders the burden of encoding all of the wisdom from God or the founders or the elders into words. And words necessarily do at least a little bit of violence to the true nature of things, which you can kind of get around using symbolism and allegory or whatnot, but only insofar as those are received with humility. And insofar as they are instead received with arrogance, then I think holistic reverence is betrayed a little bit. But obviously, for the most part, religion is going to be reverent in this regard. Now, as for faith, of course, it is the bread and butter of Western religion. Faith is cool, and it is even cooler outside of this context, where you might imagine definitions like the courage to hope, trust, or struggle in the absence of a guarantee that you will not be disappointed, betrayed, or unrewarded. However, the belief in the absence of evidence definition is not entirely unfair. I do think there is an over-reliance on faith in this sense, and a neglect of the carving of a path towards personal wisdom. And I'm not saying that if you look at the Bible, for example, that you won't find a bunch of guidance towards personal wisdom and understanding, but Christianity is not just the Bible. A religion can consist of scripture, sure, but also of churches, cultures, and a complex relationship between them. And so I don't know if this problem is a culture thing, or a church thing, or a scripture thing, but it is a thing. Because this notion that faith is just belief in the absence of evidence does not exist for no reason. Someone or something has to be responsible, and I think there's value in considering what part of that responsibility may lie at the feet of religion. You know, sometimes you hear this narrative around the so-called death of God, where it's like, oh, how could we be so foolish as to kill our God, and what are we gonna do now? And yeah, sure, how could we be so foolish as to kill our God, but also, how could God have raised foolish murderers in the first place, right? What could religion have done better so that it wasn't abandoned by its people? Which it wasn't really, to be fair. It's doing fine, but of course it's not doing amazing. That being said, yes, I do think that Western religion could do a better job at carving a path towards personal wisdom, but of course that doesn't mean there's no wisdom to be found at all here. Even if there's no clear trail, you can always walk through the thickets. The problem is that the skeptics are wearing shorts, so they don't want to walk through the thickets. Are you crazy? What if we're deceived or deluded? What if it's all lies to control you? What if it's all wishful thinking delusions? And yeah, fair enough, what if those things? But also, what if you have some faith, motherfucker? But not faith in belief. Faith in yourself, in your own curiosity and concern for truth. Because you reject things like religion for a reason, right? And the part of yourself that rejects is not going to abandon you the moment you open up a little bit. You wouldn't be a skeptic in the first place if that were the case. And so maybe you can have faith that if you do fall for delusion, that part of yourself can still pick you back up. Perhaps the fear of untruth can not just defend, but also rescue from deceit and delusion. Otherwise, you can always carve your own damn path towards personal wisdom, and that brings us towards personal experience. But before we get to it, let's stop halfway there at Buddhism for a second. Buddhism is exceptional in that it is the only popular religion that is almost exclusively about empirical practice. Like in the Abrahamic religions, you have prayer, and of course meditation comes from Hinduism, but in all of those, the scripture is still a big deal. Whereas in Buddhism, you have the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and that's about it. You can fit that in a paragraph. And yes, there's also the stories about the Buddha, but those are not quite the types of stories you find in the Vedas, the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran. They are basically just the Buddha debating other ascetic monks, or teaching some student where they'll be like, Buddha, what is the nature of the universe and everything? And the Buddha will be like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be meditating. And the student will be like, I know, I'm sorry, I was just curious, like, how does reincarnation work if there's no self? And the Buddha will be like, I didn't say there was no self. Listen, we've been through this. It's not that I don't want to tell you, it's just not something that can be told. Anything I tell you will just confuse you. If you want to know, there is a way. Just do the practice. And that is a very wise and smart and handsome thing of the Buddha to say, but at the same time, answer the question, old man. You know what I mean? That is my critique of Buddhism. Entertain my curiosity, please. Like, why are we being so ascetic about this? What happened to the middle way, man? Anyway, finally, if we remove any and all traditions, we are left with good old personal experience. And of this, I have not much to say other than it is perfect and there's nothing wrong with it. Here we have learning that is necessarily holistic and has little risk of deceit or delusion, except for trauma. I guess if you combine a vulnerable mind with unfortunate circumstances, sometimes you're gonna get a learning from experience that is not the most true thing in the world. But other than that, okay, other than that, you can trust your experiences, right? Really really the only downside of learning from personal experience is that there's not enough of it, because there's only so many things you're gonna do and only so many of those where you're gonna learn anything. And sure, in theory, you can always open your mind and heart and see God in the ashtray and in the eyes of your enemies and make even the most mundane of circumstances into a learning opportunity, but in practice, good luck with that shit. Way easier said than done, right? A more realistic expectation is that most of the time your life is just gonna be kind of boring, and if it's not boring, it's painful, and if it's not painful, it's miserable, and sometimes it's gonna be merciful, but don't hold your breath. However, I still think that optimism is the mathematically optimal strategy for a truth seeker, and here's why. Because ideally you want realism, right? But that's unrealistic. You would need to be omniscient to know where the horizon is at all times, and so necessarily you will err on the side of either optimism or pessimism, and optimism is the better error because it is more unstable. The world will keep your optimism in check, not so much your pessimism, right? If you walk looking at the sky, eventually you're gonna trip on something, but if you walk looking at your feet, you're not going to accidentally gaze at the stars. You're just gonna meander around for God knows how long, get lost, maybe at some point swallow your pride and ask for directions, but then everyone else is looking at their feet so they don't know, and then maybe at some point you remember the songs they sang about some old stars pointing towards cardinal directions, and then maybe finally you look up and you go, wow, how do I know which one it is? I don't know which one it is. So that's inefficient, right? It's much more mathematically optimal to just scrape your knees every once in a while, you know? Anyway, that is enough of my debauchery. Thank you. And before you go, please take a moment to reflect whether you want to stay on this godforsaken website or perhaps you have something else better to do. Is the next video gonna be good, or did you just get lucky? I'm assuming you like this one because you watched all the way until this point, but if you didn't, even more so, because that means you spent however many minutes watching something you didn't even like, and you're about to do it again. You're about to do it again, motherfucker. Get out of here.